This is another episode of Esports Mount Rushmore. And on this episode, we're going to go into a game that most people listening right now probably don't know a whole lot about. And even if they know about Counter-Strike, this was kind of like, I mean, it might sound harsh, but if Counter-Strike was like the sun that was doing really well and, you know, like they were making their own way in the world, they had a small business, you know, then Counter-Strike Source was kind of like the brother that they locked away in the attic, you know, and they only like fed like fish heads, and then he never really learned to read or anything, you know. And for all we know, in his mind, he might have been capable of amazing things. But unfortunately, if he did, there was no one in the attic, so no one saw them and no one really heard of them. So I'm interested to know about some of these things, because the key detail to me, the real redemption of CS Source has been CSGO. Because actually, I always say this to people. Whenever we talk, right, if you want to talk about great 1.6 players, at least half of them, it's like, oh, what if they had played CSGO? Or even worse, like, why did they not become good in CSGO? You look at CS Source, and almost every great player who went over became a good CSGO player. So as a result, I feel like the redemption of Source, like the reason why the history now means something to people where it didn't before, is because most of the names in CSGO, especially like all the French names, obviously, are Source players, basically. So now we need to know about the history of Source. And so I guess in that sense, some Source players got the last laugh in some way. So vENdetta was around in the Source scene. I mean, you also followed 1.6, but just incidentally, I'm letting people know that. And so for this episode, what's interesting about your episode is for the other ones, I always give people that like preamble, like don't just pick the 4 best players, don't pick the 4 most famous players. Ironically, you could have even done that and people still would be like, oh, yeah, didn't know about that player, you know. So that, I guess for Source, you could have gotten away with it. But still, the whole premise is it's not just like who you picked, it's why they picked them, because they have to be important to you. They have to have some significance to you. So what is the first name for CS Source that we're picking for vENdetta's Esports Mount Rushmore?
The first one is someone who's still around, and probably not a big surprise to a lot of people who pay attention to CS:GO and have some inkling of what happened in CSS, and that's going to be Existence, the true god of CSS in that sense. Obviously, people like to think about RPK, Shoxy, and those guys when it comes to just being the best player, but Existence from pretty much 2008 and out was in control of the absolute best team, to the point where you talk about NIP's domination, the fact that they went 87-0 and all of those things in offline events. Existence kind of did that, but in 2008 to 2012, more or less.
So obviously this is music to my ears, because it is well known that I am a fully paid up member of the Existence fan club, you know, like chartered member. So, and I've actually also noticed, by the way, as a general trend, that people do seem to be, it's mad because his personality is very, very, it's not in any way controversial, no, but he seems to be an incredibly polarizing figure, because people either do go to the level where it's like, you know, like, oh, we worship you, Existence, you're the god of tactics, or they go the other way and they're like, oh no, he was overrated, you know, and he wasn't as good. So when you say that line, it's a very provocative statement. He was the true god of CS Source. Now, as you mentioned, the real names that people always mention for that is they go with the star players, you know, it's Shox, it's RPK or whoever. So in what sense, what aside from just like winning tournaments, in what sense was he impactful in CS Source?
So the thing that people kind of forget when they watch Existence nowadays is the fact that, well, people focus on the fact that he doesn't have the same individual skill as a lot of his French counterparts. And back in CSS, that was not the case, because Existence could be at any given time the best player on the server or the best player in his team, even in teams with RPK, Shock, CRZ, Shock, or you know, whoever you want to bring up really from the French scene. And that was so unique with him. And today you talk about the best players in the world, they're always the most versatile ones. You have guys like Coldzera or Simple or Nico or Olaf Meister, what have you, really, who can do everything, right? They can rifle, they can op, they have really good pistols. They're just good at every facet of the game. And that was Existence throughout CSS. And not only the fact that he was extremely good as an individual player, the tactical aspect obviously played a massive part, which is evident by how much he won and how they did it, because pretty much everyone's experience of playing versus Fairy Games, Epsilon, or Redline, which was his teams throughout the CSS history, was the fact that you literally just run into like a white blanket, because the way they'd set up their strats was that they utilized flashes and utility way better than any other team ever. And you had so many more possibilities than what you had in both 1.6 and even now in CSGO, because of the removal of skyboxes. to the point where if you had, let's say, the perfect execute or the perfect setup for a strategy, you could potentially flash out the other team for the better part of 15 seconds with them not having any sort of viable retreat path or anywhere to go if they actually want to try to hold the site and everything. And Existence was kind of the driving force and the guy who made all of that come to life and did so and kept innovating for the better part of 4 years.
In Source, what was the actual prevalence of teams that tried to be like utility heavy or strat heavy in this sort of like approach? Like, were there many top teams trying to do it at the same time, when like in terms of his peers on other teams, you know? What was it like in that sense?
It was pretty much, in a lot of ways, after the French team started breaking out in the scenes, which happened from 2008 and after, everybody tried to emulate the French side because they had kind of found the golden key on how to open up every door of how you could abuse teams and everything, doing it in a tactical manner as well. It didn't rely as much on individual skill, but obviously that comes into play as with every iteration of CS. But everyone tried to adapt that tactical side that especially Existence brought to life in his teams, and that's something you saw with pretty much every top team. They needed to have this stern collar and like a rattlesnake, like a fetish, and so on, to make them pretty much achieve anything at the highest level. So everybody tried to become a copycat of Games in many ways, but nobody really managed to get to quite that level.
So one thing I found interesting when I did some cursory investigation into Source when CSGO began, and I want to know who were some of these people, what teams did they play for, is a lot of the all-time great leaders in Counter-Strike certainly are great individual leaders, and they did a great job with who they had, etc. But also a lot of them have like a strong connection with usually one star player, right? And they play with that guy their whole career. So I mean, it's the equivalent of like Phil Jackson always having like a Michael Jordan type guy in his team, Like it's the idea that you get that guy, you figure out everything around that guy, and then the other pieces are pieces you put in around that person. So as much as you don't discredit the work of the coach or the leader or whatever, I mean, there is a degree you can say as an opening statement, yeah, but Phil Jackson did have Michael Jordan. If you were comparing Phil Jackson to another in-game leader, right, that would be a valid thing to start with. And then from there, you've got to figure out what did he do with that guy. But I've noticed, okay, so in Counter-Strike, you think of some of the great leaders like Khan, where he had Forrest basically for 5 years. You think of in CSGO, obviously, Pronax, won nearly all of his championships with Olafmeister, with your Crims, with some of these players.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things I've actually noticed about Existence when I looked in Source is that actually he's like one of the few constants in those teams, and actually the star players are coming in and out, and he has almost everyone by the end. I mean, for example, Shaw was in his teams a couple of times and then wasn't in his teams, and then he had young Kenny S, and he had, the players were coming in and out at different times, and sometimes they were his enemies and he was battling them, or sometimes they were on his team. So what do you think he was like in that sense of like building a team or like using a star player, finding out how to get the best out of them?
But that was kind of the unique thing, because before 2008, there wasn't really too much to be said about the French scene in Source, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about the fact that when you think CSS today, it's all about the French scene.
Sure.
And they kind of broke out of nowhere in 2008 with the Experience, which was a Danish LAN, probably the most prestigious LAN you could go to at the time in CSS. With Epsilon, and at that point he had one player that you probably heard of today, and that's RPK on his team. For the other ones were ZRZ and Shock, not to be confused with Shoxy, and I guess Mstad, which today is Happy, so you would know him. But at that point he was kind of like your Smith of the team.
Okay.
So you didn't really pay much attention to him. But he more or less broke out with a talented bunch that nobody had really heard of, and he could do that with every single time. Because, as with in CS:GO, the French players don't necessarily get along too well over over a long period of time. So when Existence broke out with these guys, eventually it ended up being a divide in the team. They swapped out players, and come the Experience 2009, it was a very different lineup that Existence came with to the event. The only two remaining players were ZRZ and Shock, which is, not the ones you'd expect given the history of the game. You'd expect RPK to be one of the constants with Existence if they were to have a success. But instead, he constantly found new French talent, and even though the players themselves weren't necessarily the strongest individuals, he always found the players that worked perfectly in his system for them to constantly be successful. And that's one of the really insane things about Existence and why he's so highly touted by people who've been around CS for such a long time, because he was always able to bring out the best in everyone every new talent that he brought onto a team.
One of the tough things about being a tactical in-game leader I've noticed is you've got to kind of like win players over to play in the system, because actually, if you notice, not only just star players, most players who play Counter-Strike, like if I play Counter-Strike, I don't want to follow tactics and do set smokes and flashes. It's not fun. And even worse, it's a nightmare if you lose in the game and you have to go to that same spot and pick the same, that's not fun. That is the opposite of fun in the game, right? So as a result, star players are just like us, but with much better aim in a lot of senses, okay? So a lot of star players, they'll only do it if you can like convince them. So either you have to convince them by like showing them. I mean, this is usually the role like an Existence takes. It's like, I'm like the strategist. So like you're going to buy into the idea that I know better than you. So you're going to do what I say because you think that I have a better plan. Or you'll buy in because it's successful. It works. You want to win. And you can see certainly when Shoxy plays with him, sometimes it feels like that's why he would buy in. If they're winning, then he'll do all the things that they say now. Yeah. But one of the issues is, if you look at Existence's career, and this only really became like a big problem in CSGO because now he's been kicked out of all the top French teams. But I notice in Source, there was always this thing where Shox would come in the team and they would be in the team for a while, then he'd leave. And even though they tried to paint it, because obviously like the victor gets to write history, the team that he was leaving would always paint it like we kicked him because, he was kind of like his attitude really needs a lot of work, If you look at it though, it's not just Shox. Like now we've seen in CSGO, there seems to be this trend where a lot of players leave Existence's system if they aren't winning by the end of it. Eventually they just want to be like, I want to just play like a loose style or something, have fun, like I don't want to play like this super hard. So I think unfortunately he's got a rep, which may be justified, that like he's kind of like a bit overbearing tactically, and you have to go to an insane detail. What can you tell me on this sense?
Well, I think that in CSS you didn't really get to see too much of that on display because they kept winning. So it's very true what you're saying, because if you're a star player, you feel like you can get away with a lot more. You don't necessarily have to play within a rigid system to be successful, because you can just be better than other people individually and go from there. In CSS, we didn't really get to see that all that much because they were winning constantly, and you'd have periods where guys like RPK or Shoxy would actually leave Existence's team, try to make a new French team, and try that out for a while, play a looser style, not as tactical and not as rigid, and not end up not winning, and then figuring out like, okay, we should probably go back to Existence way and join up with him again, win some more, and once you get tired of it, then you try something new to kind of refresh yourself. I think that's having people buy into a system as an in-game leader is one of the hardest jobs you can have, because obviously if people don't follow you blindly into battle, then you're going to falter like very, very quickly. And I think that's what we saw really with the downfall of Titan and everything. The fact that players lost faith in Existence, the fact that he was the smartest person on the server, that he was by far the smartest person in the team, and then you see pretty much a disjointed unit running around trying to do things on their own, and obviously that didn't pan out in a good way. But for the better part of CSS, that was never really an issue, partly because Existence was able to carry himself better than he was in CSGO, just on an individual basis, but also because there was nothing to actually refute the fact that Existence was like the end-all be-all in-game leader.
So you've referenced it already, but I have heard, and here's the thing, even people who are at odds with Existence now, so like an MBK or a Shox, if you ask them, what is it about this repper I've heard about Existence that actually somehow he was a really good individual player, who's some sort of like sick opera or something in CS Source, none of those guys, even if they personally don't like him for whatever reasons, none of them deny it. They all say, oh no, it's true, he was a very good individual player. What do you think about, like, if someone's only seen him in CSGO individually, like, did something not translate? Did he just stop playing that stuff? What is the issue, do you think?
Well, one thing is obviously there's a much bigger player base, so you have a lot higher competition in CSGO. That's one thing you have to factor in, even if you want to try to look at it as positively as you can for Existence part. But it's also the fact that he kind of changed up his style as well. Obviously, with a new game, there's different mechanics and different ways of how you utilize the different weapons. In CSS, you had Existence opping like a lot, to the point where he was probably one of the more reliable guys. He'd always be the secondary opper and at times be the main opper for his teams. just because he was so good with it. And obviously with CS:GO, you have a different, like slightly different movement system. The off works in a different way in terms of how the scope works and everything. And I'm not sure why he went away from offing because he was so good at it, but he decided to focus primarily on being a rifler. And with different weapons, he didn't translate his skills as good or as well from CSS as he did to CS:GO. And I think the fact that he waned off the op instead of trying to become proficient with it in CS:GO actually hurt him quite a bit in the teams he played with. But I think that's partly also because he's the kind of guy who will take the hit for his team when he understands that there's some players on his team that are better than him at various aspects. So obviously when you go to CS:GO, he's playing with Kenny. You're obviously going to give the op to Kenny S. Like you're unless you're a retard, you're going to give the op to Kenny. I think he took that, might have taken that to a bit of an extreme to the point where he would never actually give himself the opportunity to be successful with it either. So I think that's a shame because people who haven't seen Existence play anything but CS:GO, they don't really know how good of a player he is.
Okay, so who was the second name that we're going to put up there with Existence?
The second name is going to be another Frenchie, but probably one that nobody really knows who is these days, and that's Regnam.
Yep.
Regnam was the other guy in the French scene in terms of being like a team leader. So whenever people would leave Existence teams, they would probably join Regnam's team. And at a certain point, Regnam also would end up playing in the same team as Existence in very games as well. But the reason why I chose Regnam is because, not necessarily because he was just a very good individual player and a good team leader, it's because he was one of the reasons why CSS as a game became way more competitive and actually became a functional game. Because, as you would know, having tried Source when it came out, it was just a complete mess of a game. It took about 3 years from release to the point where CSS was actually a decent game. And Regnam was one of the big reasons why that actually came to be, because he was constantly trying to make the game better, whether it was through having server add-ons that would block certain things or allow for certain aspects to be allowed. Like for instance, we had a period of time where bunny jumping was just absolutely ridiculous. Like obviously in 1.6 you could get minor advantages from having extreme movement, as is very apparent with guys like Forrest and Neo, because the way they could move around on the map would just give them that tiny bit of an edge that would allow them to just absolutely dominate. And in CSS you had bunny hopping to the extremes where you could actually, if you take Dust 2, if you started on the T side, you can actually bunny hop down Suicide, out double doors, and end up running up to the B-bomb side with the CTs. Like you could gain that kind of an insane speed. And Regnum was the kind of guy who worked on add-ons and plugins for servers who balanced out the game to the point where it felt like a viable competitive game. And then, so that's like one of the biggest draws to him, the fact that he always tried to make the game better, in addition to the fact that he was part of some of the most successful French teams of all time. And he was also one of those people who was just well respected throughout the scene. Any French player would probably tell you that. Regnam, not being the best individual player in France at any given point, he was always someone you could go to. You could reliably join a team with Regnam and know you're going to have success.
Okay, so as you said, at times he was like the other leader, and if you imagine it now as like Carrigan and MSL from the Danish scene, if you don't play for one, you're going to play for the other, and the idea is actually both of them are probably eyeing up each other's players, like, oh, I wonder what happened if I got Cajun B, that sort of scenario. So, but one of the interesting things when I did my research on this guy was he actually also played with Existence in some teams, Now, when they played together, like, here's the other thing. I know Existence for all of his career wasn't the in-game leader always, Like, I think it was KRL originally, wasn't, and he like took over ran the mantle or whatever and became an in-game leader. Like actually some in-game leaders do, where you have to just embrace it because you need one, right? Mm-hmm. When they were in teams together, how did that operate?
That operated kind of in a similar way, like you see now with having secondary callers in that sense. So Existence would be the head honcho at the end of the day, but you'd have Regnam who would constantly be that second voice to him, who would come up with ideas, and depending on how the game plays out, he could take control of the game or take the reins and lead the team from there on out. So they had like this solid understanding between each other that they obviously were looking to do the best for the team, at any given point, and they just had this extremely good synergy. Like if you want to go to basketball once again, it would be similar to Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, right?
Okay.
Both fantastic individual players, obviously, but sometimes like Michael Jordan would have the understanding to realize when Scottie is having a sick game. Like when Michael might be off and he's going to have to work as the facilitator instead of the guy who slashes and drives the entire time, because he has people to fall back on, and it was kind of that kind of a relationship between the two. So when Existence wasn't finding the openings in whatever team they were playing, defense or offense, he could rely on Regnam to bring him through.
Okay, so one thing I need you to set the context for me in CS Source is like the downside of CS Source, and this is why, even though it's not just because I didn't follow it as a game, but a problem that even people from Source acknowledge is it didn't have major lands in the same way. I mean, for example, it finally got some like ESWCs and stuff, which were the equivalent of a major. But the problem is in obviously 1.6 used to have like 3 or 4 of those level of events in a year, you know, and so you could kind of, it's funny, they weren't officially recognized majors like they are in CSGO, so now it's easy for anyone to know what a major is, but everyone in the 1.6 scene knew what the majors were, and the funny thing is, there never was any debate, even though these were like arbitrarily decided events, as to whether one was a major. Like players themselves would even say, like, oh, that's the one I really want to win, even if I won like the same event with the same teams a week earlier, it was a dream hack. No, I want to win ESWC, or I want to win WSVG, whatever it might be. Any of these tournaments. So I know the problem in Source is there weren't many of those tournaments. And so the problem then becomes, as an outsider, you can't really know which tournaments were the key ones to win, or for example, how small a tournament is. Like, for example, I know that actually EPS France used to be like a big deal to the French Source players, and obviously if France was the best country, maybe that takes on a value like some of the Swedish only tournaments did in 1.6, where it's maybe probably still be really competitive. So Regnam also won a lot of competitions. What was his actual success level like how, in that sense, how were his accomplishments matching up against all the great players of his era?
Obviously, playing with vENdetta, because he played with 2 different iterations of vENdetta. The very first edition of vENdetta was the one with KRL.
This is before Existence, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, because at that point, Existence was playing for Redline, who just came off the victory of the Experience. And I think this was 2009, he played with Redline, and 2008 was with Epsilon. So he played in the team that had, well, I guess today you would look at that first vENdetta lineup as the star one. It had Smith, Shoxy, RPK, and so on, and KRL. And obviously, like, they would win an absolute insane amount of tournaments. And you had a couple of lands every year that was just regarded as the majors, not because they had a magnificent prize pool, because let's be honest, nothing in CSS really did. But it was simply because just where it fit into the calendar allowed for every top team to attend them. So in many ways, like, how you should judge a major tournament should be by how good teams or how many good teams attend the event.
So I'm guessing one of these was Copenhagen Games, was it?
Copenhagen Games was one of the staples in CSS. LAN 79 in France, definitely the Experience in Roskilde in Denmark became one of the absolute major events. And then you had I-Series, actually. I-Series oftentimes attracted very, very good teams in CSS, and stuff like DSRAC. And as you mentioned, ESWC after a while. And that was kind of the go-to events. You had a couple of one-offs that you would hope that would have like a successor to it, like SHG Open, for instance, had a lot of good teams come to it, but it ended up just being a one-time thing. Instead of just having a SHG Open in 2007, 8, 9, and so on, it would just end up being the one-off. But LAN 79, DSRAC, Copenhagen Games, and the Experience were probably the bigger ones throughout the history with I-Series as well, because they had multiple events happening. But Regnam had found success pretty much at all of them. He won LAN 79 in 2010, won DSRAC 2 and DSRAC 3 in Denmark, won Copenhagen Games in 2011. All of these with vENdetta, but under obviously with different lineups. And I think he even got a top 3 at I-Series when he was before his real, I guess, rise to the top, which was with Emulate. The CSS team of Emulate, obviously 1.6 part being more well known.
Sure.
But in terms of accomplishment, he kind of won everything you could have dreamt of winning as a CSS player, except for the national tournaments, which for some reason, France being such a insanely good country, or just an insanely good CSS nation, they never actually won a European Nations Cup, which is baffling to some people. But he won pretty much everything else you could have won as a player.
So one of the interesting things is when I looked at his age, he's only like 28 now, which means that when CSGO came out, he must have been about 24, 25, so still not too old. Yeah. But the thing is, he's someone who doesn't appear to have given any kind of a shot at playing CSGO or trying to be pro. Now, I will add in the caveat. You always have to remember this when you think about like 1.6 players who didn't bother trying it. It was a very small game when it came out. And actually, the first few tournaments made it look like, everyone in like IEMs, they're all bailing on this game. It's probably just going to fail outright, So I understand why people, it's not like now. Like if you knew how much money there is now, I tell you what, a lot of 1.6 pros were stuck with it for 2 years to see, right?
For sure.
But with that said, I mean, he came from the Source scene. Obviously, he's had a lot of success in Source. Did it surprise you that he never tried his hand at CSGO?
Somewhat surprisingly, yes, because one of the things that plays a big factor as well is that if you came from 1.6, which obviously was the big brother of the two games, that had more money, it had more sponsors, more viewership, everything really. And looking how CSGO started out, you wouldn't see that as a viable career path. Sure. At any point. So it's understandable for a 1.6 player who's played at the top going into CSGO that it's just not worth their time anymore. For CSS players, it was different because even though it was smaller, like CSGO was smaller than 1.6, it was still bigger than Source ever was. So for a lot of people who still had that fire within them, they would obviously give it a go. I think Regnam on his end, towards the later stages of his CSS career, he started on focusing more on actually just developing the game to be as good as possible together with Jedi, with the plugin ZBlock, which again became kind of the standard for tournaments. In many ways, like if you imagine eBot basically controlling the settings of the game to the point where it allows you to do certain things and basically removes stuff like let's say Russian jumping, right? Like you had in 1.6, like it would make it literally impossible to actually do that, so you couldn't fuck up the hitboxes and everything when you come around corners. And they did that kind of thing. So he became more of an admin in that sense, or someone who try to improve the game more than actually focusing on becoming a better individual player, which is somewhat surprising because for a lot of people, obviously it was a similar engine as CSS, so movement and everything would have been a lot easier of a transition for a CSS player than a 1.6 player. So in that sense, it always surprised me a little bit. But I think he also ended up having a kid, so becoming a father and all that stuff took away his focus from actually playing full time and trying to be the best, end up in the best French team possible.
Okay, so from what I saw of Source and actually trying it a little bit in the latter days, one thing about it that I prefer over CS:GO is it was more possible to control the weapons better. Okay, so in that sense, it was different from 1.6, but it shared that with 1.6. Whereas part of what is problematic about CS:GO is it's not the idea that it's just hard to control the spray; it's that there's elements of luck to it where it's borderline impossible to really like it all to be in your control. You've got to kind of have a bit of guessing, a bit of prediction stuff. So the question I have that is a genuine, because I don't understand it myself. I want to know what your take on it is. One of the things that people used to criticize about Source, even some Source players, was that some of the things was overpowered in the game, like the Deagle, and obviously people said the AWP at times, right? And so if these things were they overpowered to the extent that it meant that skill was more of a premium? Like, for example, whenever I watch those highlight movies of Shocks back in Source, it looks like, the guy was unkillable. He just wrecked everyone with the AK all the time. But at the same time, in theory, if something's like overpowered but easy, that might level out the skill. It might become more about decision-making. So what do you think the balance was like in that sense in Source?
It's weird because you bring up the Deagle, for instance. The Deagle in CSS is probably the most broken weapon that's ever been in any CS game. Okay. But it still kind of worked. And it's weird because I'm one of the guys even today in CSGO that hates how the pistols work in CSGO, but the Deagle in CSS was way worse in that sense. But it was just kind of a unified understanding of that is the one go-to pistol. And yes, it is broken, but everybody has Like everybody can use it to a certain extent. So that kind of how it played. That's how it balanced out by the fact that anyone could actually be proficient with it. It was obviously more skill based than luck, because with if you take the Deagle today, sure, it's like in certain aspects it's all about skill, but at times you just have such a big spread of just bullet spread pretty much with the Deagle, depending on how you use it, that sometimes it's just a lot of luck involved if you actually get multiple kills with it. While in CSS, the recoil reset pretty much instantly. It was extremely accurate even when running. So sure, it was overpowered, but you'd actually have to have skill to be, to make it worthwhile.
Okay.
So a guy like Shoxy, for instance, he would always be able to punish you way harder than anyone who wasn't at his level, because in the end it comes down to how good of aim you have, like how good you are at actually just moving about and all of that kind of stuff. But for the other weapons, I think it was fairly okay in terms of just general balance. I never got the impression, or I never felt really that the op, for instance, was vastly broken or anything, because you could still see extreme differences with people who were the best of the best with the weapon. I think that's how it should be. Obviously, like skill should always come out ahead of everything else, and that's why you see players like NES and Guardian absolutely beasting people with the op, and then just being a solidified, best player in the world at that weapon, which wouldn't happen if there was too much randomness in the game.
Sure.
The only gripe I really had about CSS weaponry was in, like, it's like you said, with the spray in CS:GO, it's weird, and I never really got a good feel for it, because in 1.6 in Source the spray pattern was randomized between a certain set amount of patterns, which is not good for competitive playing, but you'd have a feeling of the feedback from the weapon when you were shooting, so you'd be able to adjust. Yeah. And that was the good part. In CS:GO, I don't get that sense when I play the game. Okay. The fact that if I'm starting to shoot, it's more of a crapshoot where I'm actually going to have to adjust my mouse. Well, in 1.6 in Source, you actually had that feedback the entire time. 1.6 had it down to a fucking science, to the point where you could literally start out anywhere on the map and then drag 180 degrees and still be in control of what you were doing if you were actually good at the game. Yeah.
No, that's a good way to describe it. I mean, actually, I hadn't really thought of it that way myself, but that's actually probably my biggest complaint about CSGO. It's not that I only played the game for a month and I just haven't got used to it. No, I've played the game for years now, and I still do not have that sense of, like, how to adjust to the feedback. Like, for example, in CS 1.6, I used to be one of the ridiculous players where, like, I went to the extreme. I used to just, like, once I saw an opponent, it's like I would start firing and then I'd move the spray onto him. Which I realised, obviously, that's not an ideal way to fire anyway, but it worked, right? I could make it work, and the idea was that's just the style that I intuitively learned to play, and I would correct depending on where it was going, and I could kind of tell where the bullets were going at that point in time. Yeah. So the part that never made sense in CSGO is, like, I mean, there's a reason why everyone goes crazy if someone does a good spray transfer. It's because that's still not really possible. Like, for example, I remember Nothing once made a video on this, which was very good, where he was trying to explain to people how to spray at, like, medium range with a Colt. And what he did was he basically told people that you don't spray transfer. What you do is you make sure you have the crosshair onto the guy first, then you sort of, like, wait until it goes to the level it's going to go at, and then you just hold it there, and you're just, like, moving it left to right, basically. You're not. Whereas in CS 1.6, for example, you're, like, trying to sort of like trace out the spray pattern and then shift it, so you just, like, you're doing, like, tiny little corrections or up and down depending on what it is, So I mean, that's a very good way to describe it, I guess, the difference between the two games. So who is the third name going to be on this Mount Rushmore?
My third name is going to be PHP. For those who don't know, PHP was a Slovakian player who pretty much brought the entire Eastern Europe scene to relevancy in CSS. And not only that, but he did it while being, like, probably, if you want to make a top 5 list of just, like, the best players overall in CSS history, he would easily be in there. Like, he would be at the level of Shox, RPK, Wants, those guys. But the thing that's so unique about him is the fact that he also did it in pretty much a route that you'd never see happen in CSGO today. And that's, he's basically started from the bottom with, local players, and he stayed true to that course pretty much. He played with Slovakians and people from the Czech Republic more than, trying to branch out, go to, let's say, Germany, or go to start playing with people from France or people from the UK or anything like that. He would stick true to his countrymen or the people around him. And even with the deficit of having a much smaller scene, he was able to find extreme success doing so. That's one of the reasons why he would be one of the guys on my Mount Rushmore, simply because he was able to find success when he shouldn't have been able to. Because if you think about it today, the odds of someone, let's say, starting out in, at this point, it doesn't really matter what country you're starting either. If you start out, let's say, in Sweden, it's just, you have 5 friends playing. The odds of that team over the span of 2 years actually becoming relevant in any sort of way without having to change out players, or the best player in that team hops over to like a semi-pro team and then onto a fringe tier 3, tier 2 team, and then, going that route, that's pretty much unthinkable. But he was able to do that while just being an absolutely dominating presence. And he alone made his teammates so good, and all of the rosters he played with so good that he was able to be competitive, even when you would look at a lineup pound for pound and say there's no way they should have a chance. He would always be able to make them competitive and oftentimes come out, for the better of it.
Okay, so the interesting thing is, if you'd have just set it up there, you could have done like a mad twist. You could have been like, well, I mean, my next name is, one of the most skilled players. He's from Slovakia. I mean, his name is... Guardian. But here's the interesting thing is that I remember... Okay, so I didn't follow Source, watch the games, but I used to see the news posts and stuff because I obviously worked in esports and I saw the different websites that had news on. And the thing is, PHP was a name I heard all the time and I saw some frag movies of, whereas Guardian's someone where I didn't really know much about him because he only had a couple of years as far as I can tell where he was like a relevant player in Source, and then he switched to 1.6, and then eventually CSGO's really his game where he came to the full 4, So this guy was obviously the guy, right? He was better than Guardian?
Oh yeah,
more of an impactful player or something.
Absolutely, because PHP again, he's kind of the player who would be similar to Olaf Meister in that way, that he could do everything, and at times he would also actually be the in-game leader as well for his teams, which is pretty unthinkable that you would actually be the best player in your team at every aspect, right? That doesn't really happen anymore. Even when Guardian joined up with the recent gaming team, Guardian would be the one who would post the most highlights and have the most memorable clips from tournaments, and understandably so, because it was absolutely insane too. But PHP would always be the guy who'd get 25 frags, and he would just do it every single game. So Guardian, sure, he might have a crazy 4K in one round or a crazy double, that type of thing, but PHP would always be the reliable guy who was extremely skilled. Because normally when you talk about reliable players, you talk about someone like Al, for instance, from SK lineups, that never really baffled anyone in terms of his individual skill. He was just there, reliable, did what he had to do, and as a team, you're super happy about having that guy. But if you can have that guy be the best player on your team as well, then you're just bound to have success at some point.
Okay, so one of the things I noticed was that the team that PHP was in, when they were winning tournaments like I-Series, etc., was when they were playing UK teams, like Henry G's teams, these sorts of ones, I mean, before there was the Mangia Capra ones. What is the timeline of when PHP was very good and his teams were good, and then the French teams coming in, was this a transition period or something?
They actually mixed pretty nicely, because the only team that was able to really do anything to French teams was Reason Gaming, and that's a bit of an over-exaggeration. Obviously, there were other competitive teams, but if you go back to 2006 and 2007, you'd have obviously the UK teams, Finnish teams like Insignia Cadre, Four Kings, and Fnatic, the Dutch lineup. They would be the dominating presence in the scene. But then Reason Gaming come up at a point where the French guys are basically just winning everything, and then you'd have these guys from the Czech Republic and Slovakia who actually would take them to the very edge and actually manage to play them head to head. And Reason Gaming was, even after the CGS franchises came into play with the Birmingham Salvo, with Medja and Carpra, and so on, they were still one of the few teams that were actually able to beat them. They were kind of like that thorn in the side of every other top team in the world. So normally you'd have matchups in CSGO today where you'd say like VP match up extremely well versus these guys and would pretty much always beat them at an offline event. Yep. So if they get matched up in a bracket, you think like, okay, VP should be super happy about that. No one was ever happy about being matched up with Reason Gaming.
Okay. So in that case, maybe they are like the Virtus Pro, because before now, when Virtus Pro is the best now, they were always the team where, like, even earlier this year where everyone was like, oh, they're in a slump. I was like, no one wants to see them in the bracket, mate. Like, that's the nightmare matchup, because everyone knows they might just go ham on you, you know?
Yeah, and but the one place where they actually were quite different is the fact that Reason Gaming, the way they rose to fame was through online tournaments. Okay. Which is very... Didn't
everyone think as a result that they cheated then?
Yeah, and that's one of the because before Guardian joined, they played with a player called WT or VT, who was pretty much one of the. He was the case, or yeah, he was pretty much patient zero in the first like proper witch hunt of a player, where every top players would come out and say like there's no way this guy's legit. The things he does is just unreal, and there's no way these guys are clean. And the crazy part about it is like even when all of that is happening, PHP was still the best player in the team. Okay. That kind of goes to show how kind of a unbelievably skilled player is when you have one guy on your team that's everybody's convinced that is just full of shit, like guaranteed to be wall hacking or something like that.
Never been a player like that in CSGO, don't worry. So keep going.
no, never happened, of course. Never seen a single video of any player at the top level being accused of that. Okay. But yeah, that was VT, and they would just dominate top teams in online tournaments, and win significant prize purses as well in online tournaments, or win PCs and that type of thing, or just qualification spots for tournaments. But all through that, PHP was still the best player in the team, but nobody really ever had any doubts about how legitimate of a player he was.
Ah, okay. Because I know, for example, that, I mean, maybe this is to do with it, but I know that Guardian was someone who was cited as like has to be a cheat. I mean, I understand why, because like if I saw his particular skill set, like just hit the fastest flick shot ever online, I'd be like, yep, that's cheating. So, yeah. But this never transferred over to PHP, though. People knew he was legit.
Yeah, it's kind of funny actually, because with Reason Gaming, VT was also the opper of Reason Gaming before Guardian joined. So they kind of went from having one hack-accused opper who would absolutely decimate people from time to time in the most weird ways you can imagine, to getting Guardian as well, who would do the exact same thing. And at that point, obviously Guardian wasn't a big name from 1.6 when he hopped over, and VT was pretty much a guy who came out of nowhere as well. So there were obvious similarities between the two players, and they have the same kind of style in the sense that they would hit absolutely insane flick shots to the point where it doesn't make sense, or you'd actually just not see the player on your screen because they were doing it so quickly. They were so good at just fast scoping, and the reaction time was just like something out of a jet fighter, pilot. It was absolutely insane. But yeah, no. They definitely created some controversy when they first broke out, but then when they started doing the same things at events, then people kind of just had to keep their mouth shut. But Guardian was also even Guardian, he had to struggle with the fact that he was still hack accused after going to events as well. There's just this famous movie of him from Land 79 where you see some absolutely ridiculous shots that he does over the span of one tournament. Normally you'd see frag movies being over the course of multiple tournaments, over the course of 6 months and everything, and he would pretty much pack all of that into one tournament or within the span of 3 games. So he was one of the first guys to be accused of using Ventrilo.exe, which is the first silent aimbot that came in CS. But as time shown, that was not the case. It was just generational talent with the op.
Okay, so one thing that people will have noticed is a trend in how I think about the game is this. You can notice a pattern where I always am accused of overrating players who are carry players, but don't have as good teammates as the other star players. And obviously, as a result, I think they are underrated by the community. For example, I think the players that get overrated, unfortunately, are pretty good players who are sort of star level, but they have an amazing team around them, and then they look a lot better as a result because they have a lot more opportunity, and obviously it minimizes some of your downside. So, for example, this is one of the things that I've always put whenever we have the debate over is Neo the best 1.6 player? It's not only was he unbelievably good, but he essentially just got a bunch of people who had no chance of ever being Hall of Fame players or winning massive tournaments, and just was we're just going the whole way together, to the top of CS 1.6 at the time, you know, and then even then we're not going to change players. We're just going to keep with these guys, and then if someone plays worse, I guess I just have to play even better and win the game. So I've always thought that's insane, right? Now, you described here, like, PHP wasn't necessarily the highlight player in his team, but if he was able to take these, like, local players and, again, play for so much of his career with players from a region where, I mean, these players weren't relevant in 1.6 at all. Like, these countries had no relevance in 1.6, basically. Like, they just never had anything. Did he have any of this quality to him, do you think? Like, some super hard carry, or what was his impact in that sense?
Absolutely. He was so good that he could carry teams. In a weird way, it worked out to the point where he could carry teams of inexperienced players for long enough to the point where they would, like, the other players would actually catch up and in terms of skill. So you have PHP pretty much just being that big bulldozer that just paves the way for the other guys to have learning experiences and figure out how to play at a pro level and play versus the best teams in the world and actually be efficient at it. And also understanding how to play within your role. So sure, you're not going to match up favorably in every game you play, but you'd still, you know what your best percentage chance is going to be at any given moment of time. So basically, yeah, he gave them the time to adapt into smart players, because the reason gaming labs were never the most scary ones individually. They had PHP and they had Guardian or VT. But outside of that, they had UN, PR, and Snipes, and towards the later stage, there's a guy called Bazi, and none of those were ever they were never in the discussion of, like, oh, if you want to make a team of let's say the 5 best players from a certain region, they wouldn't even be mentioned.
Oh, okay.
And that's how good PHP was at just getting the best out of his players, and in similar ways actually to how Existence did it. Obviously, they went different ways about it. But PHP was kind of that big shield for his team that allowed the other players to develop into being actually proficient pro players.
So when I set up the context for the Regnam question about, like, how big were these tournaments he was winning, or what were the level of accomplishments, I mean, from the tone of how we've talked about PHP, people must understand that, again, he was playing with local players who weren't great players, and he was, in some sense, he's, like, boosting them to some degree to get them to a good level. It's very unlikely that player then, I mean, amazingly, Neo did do it in 1.6, but it's very unlikely that player is then going to also win the biggest tournament. So what was actually the accomplishment level? Because when I look over his resume, I don't really see, like, the huge LAN wins, right? Like all of the internationals with everyone there. Yeah,
no, in terms of, they ended up winning a few ice years and everything. Obviously, because there's a limit to how much of the CSS history is actually recorded and put down in an archive and all that stuff, you're not going to find everything. But in terms of accomplishment, I would put him in, and this is, not accounting for, I guess, the fringe players and teams like Very Games and those kind of teams. But I would probably put him in, like, a top 4 in terms of, like, how accomplished he was as a player, just from LAN events and everything. Because that's slightly biased, because I do take into consideration the fact that he did come from nothing. In that sense, he didn't have a lot to work with, so the fact that he was able to accomplish anything at all makes it all the more impressive. Okay. So it's not quite at a Neo level in that sense, because, like you said, Neo was able to keep his team relevant for 10 plus years. I guess it extends even more now as they keep playing. But he was able to do that for such a long time in 1.6, and win, like, all of the majors. PHP never really won too many majors, but he would always place extremely high in every tournament that was worth a damn in CSS.
Okay. So I know in CSS, much like 1.6 actually, there wasn't a whole lot of, like, imports, basically. Like, you wouldn't get a scenario like even the scenario of, like, Alu going to NIP, that would never happen in a top Swedish team 1.6, because why would they get there's so many Swedish players, they'll just get another Swedish player. It would never make sense to even try him, even if they were actually an amazing player, So obviously this couldn't really have probably happened in CS Source, but if PHP had decided to kind of just go, like, the Sith route, and he was like, actually, fuck helping my region, like, I'm helping PHP, and he'd just tried to go to the best team, and he'd gotten some other top European team, to bring him in, would he have been someone who would have just won all the tournaments and had some super high level of success? What is your take on that?
I would have seen that as very likely, because one of the things that oftentimes one of the issues you run into when you have players from Eastern Europe trying to play with people from Western Europe is the fact that their their English skills are basically just not up to par, to the point where you can't actually communicate efficiently. PHP more or less he became good by playing with everyone. So obviously back then you had IRC and various invite channels and everything, and he was one of the very, very few who would actually put it on himself to actually make contact with other players. So for instance, for the longest time we would play when he was back in Defeaters, which is Defeaters / Asuba, which was the team before Reason Gaming, which again was pretty much the same guys playing on the team, but just a different name. He would always be the one who, make sure, or like talk to people like, hey, you guys, if you guys are playing an online cup today, can I join? Like, do you have a spot for me? And all of that stuff. So, he didn't just make sure that he was a good individual player, but also the fact that he spoke to everyone else, and he actually made sure that he knew the various individual players from every top scene. And towards the end of it, I guess it didn't really happen in CSS, but at the start of CSGO, because he played like a tiny bit in CSGO at the very beginning, he did actually go that route of trying to make a team with non-local players. So he ended up in a team. I think it was called Power Gaming, if I recall correctly. Power Gaming, and that was with Stinger and I want to say Rattlesnake.
Okay, UK player.
Yeah, like UK player. So pretty much it would be UK, Norway, and PHP. Well, Stinger being the one player from Norway. So he did go that route eventually, but that was at the point where still when it was like in the middle of his medical studies and everything. So it petered out fairly quick and never really amounted to anything.
Okay.
But I definitely could have seen him being successful in a team like. He would absolutely thrive in lineups like that. If you put him into a team like FaZe, etc., he wouldn't be the reason why they were fucking up communication-wise, for instance. Like, he would be perfectly fine.
So who is the fourth and final name?
The fourth and final name, and I struggled with this for a long, long time because there's so many players I would have liked to mention, but I'm going to go with another familiar face for people who played CSGO, and that's Fetish.
Okay, so that's actually incredibly provocative, vENdetta, because you have to realise that, unfortunately, if we imagine the tombstone of Fetish, it goes like this, in CSGO at least. It goes like, died because somehow he never got the best out of his CSGO players. Because obviously he was in like the Dignitas lineup, which basically is Astralis now, and famously they were always good. They were sometimes like bordering on very good, and then Carrigan came in. Like, it's like he got up for a minute, Carrigan sat down, and then just like won titles with them. So everyone's kind of like, wow, that Fetish guy was the problem. Like, he's one of the one times where that meme might have been correct, And then obviously he went to the other Dignitas team, and he had a bunch of players there, which later with MSL became pretty good. And again, he was struggling. He couldn't qualify for majors. Then MSL just pops in. Like, listen, I'm not even an in-game leader, but I'll give it a go. Oh, and now it's working for me. So now I know the rep of Fetish in Source is very different, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Fetish is pretty much the Danish version of Existence in many ways. Famous for his very rigid leadership style, kind of being, in a sense, a bit of a dictator in his teams. But seeing how the main focus in CSS was that you had to be tactically proficient as a team if you wanted to have success, that obviously played a bigger part in CSGO, especially during the time where Fetish was at his most active when he had his most struggles were when the metagame of CS shifted away from having heavy focus on the tactical side of things to focusing more on individual plays, right? So when you saw the likes of Fnatic or NIP for that matter, but they were prominent from the start, or LDLC for instance, like when those teams with a very loose play style would find success. So obviously Fetish was never the greatest individual player, not even back in Source, but he was always the brainchild of all the success that every Danish team that he was in found. So, and he also had this uncanny ability to actually get the best out of his players in CSS. So he played with the best Danish player of all time once, and kind of broke him out in a sense to the point where you had a legitimate discussion of who was the actual best player in the world, if it was Wants, Shocks, or RPK. Okay. And he managed to do that to quite a few Danish players, and he was always able to actually make have a lot of impact with lesser lineups. So one of his first teams that actually had any sort of success was a team called Extreme Precision, or X-Spray. And they on that team they had pretty much a lot of almost at the top kind of players, basically like top 3, top 4 Danish teams, like that kind of a level of players in their team. But as time went on, he would be able to mold those players into becoming some of the best in Europe. One of them famously being Jimmy, who had a pretty short career span in CSS, but at the time, like while he was playing, was just regarded as one of the best 5 players in all of CSS.
Okay, so one of the interesting things about Fetish is that in terms of accomplishments, like this is weird because actually Denmark's another country that it was, obviously very prominent in CS Source, not least because they had tons of the lands were there,
Yeah.
Whereas, for example, like Sweden, not really, because obviously Sweden was obsessed with 1.6, So I've noticed Denmark had a lot of players. Obviously, in CSGO, most of the Danish players in this game are from CS Source, and Fetish was around. He was a leader for a long time. But it seems like he doesn't have that many like huge tournament wins. Like, for example, it's not that many where he's beating the French teams. And in general, the Danish teams aren't really battling them. Why with like that talent base and that infrastructure, do you think like him and the Danish teams weren't really like... why? Like, for example, in terms of accomplishments, he's not at like the existence level, right?
Well, part of that is because even though, like in my eyes, Fetish was kind of the to alter the quote, behind every strong man, there's a strong woman. Behind every strong Danish team,
Right.
there's Fetish.
No disrespect, obviously. We mean that as an analogy, yeah. Okay.
But even back then, and this is a problem that the Danish students had for a long time, they would split their talent. And you see that today in CSGO as well, obviously. Astralis was meant to be the clear-cut #1 team in CSGO from Denmark, but then, things doesn't work out as well as you think they would by judging the team on paper, and now we have Dignitas being the best Danish team in the country. So it's kind of a similar story with the players and the teams in Denmark as well, because he started out not being in one of the best teams. So Extreme Precision wasn't regarded as or highly touted outside of Denmark in that sense. They never really had the biggest accomplishments at international events and so on, but he would just constantly get a little bit better with new players, because you had I guess the set in stone best Danish teams, which was H2K, Magnitude, Meet Your Makers, which is like the same bunch of players, which is actually like old Spirit of Amiga players.
Okay.
Those guys would kind of just have the 7 usual suspects kind of rotate in and out, similar to what a lot of the French teams used to do. But those were like the set in stone best Danish teams, and then Fetish always had to find someone new to bring into his lineup, and then try to find success with it instead of just starting at the top each and every time. And I think that impacted his results as well. So you'd see multiple events where they not necessarily bomb out at a 7th to 8th or something, but that'd be their first encounter at a big event, and then for the next event they go to, they get gradually better and better and better. So in a way, he's a bit of a Kong in that sense. If you want to go back to StarCraft, the fact that he would always get second place, he would never really have the biggest of wins.
Yeah.
But yeah, his teams would always be up there in the top 4s of most tournaments, even with having a divided talent pool.
Does the fact that in CS Source he often was like, it's close, you did well, you did a good job, but didn't win, is there any connection, do you think, to what happened in CSGO, where basically those Dignitas lineups he had, and Copenhagen Wolves before that, were basically, for most of their time, they were good enough to have beaten like a very games in a nip and to have won the tournament and have made the. But oftentimes they wouldn't even, like, they were the ones that really never made the finals. They were like the semi-final team, I mean, at least TSM had won some events and actually made some finals. Like, I think people go too far with that one, but they obviously had some sort of a block. And unfortunately, since when he left and Carrigan came in, they for a while seemed to overcome that block. People do think, right, well, if he left and then the block went, then he was the block, people put it all on him. So was there any connection that you see between his Source and CSGO careers in that sense?
Not necessarily. I think one of the issues with being extremely successful in CSS was the fact that you had varied games there, right?
Yeah.
And if it wasn't varied games, it was another French team. So you had very clear-cut favorites pretty much at every tournament you went to. And I guess we shouldn't leave out the UK teams either, because they were actually extremely good in CSS. But it wasn't as open of a field as it is today in CSGO. Like right now, we had the last 6 tournaments being won by 6 different teams. That would never happen in CSS, and I think that's partly why you don't see too many first place finishes for Fetish more than anything. I don't think it came down to the fact that he was the problem due to his let's say lack of individual skill or stubbornness when it came to strategy. I definitely don't think that's the case. I think if you're going to bring out like someone from today's scene really and kind of put them or compare them to each other, I guess MSL would be an okay comparison in the sense that Fetish towards the latter end wasn't the greatest individual player, but without him, that like those teams would pretty much fall apart. And I think it's the same thing with vENdetta today as well. If you remove MSL from that lineup, you end up with a lot worse team than what you would have by just keeping him. Even though he doesn't necessarily live up to the standards of everyone else in the team, just individually, but he brings so much else in terms of like actually making sure they stick to a system and actually have a game plan in any type of situation. I think that was invaluable for all of the teams they were in.
Okay, so I've noticed there's a trend here, vENdetta, which is like, for example, when I said who's the last name, and then you said Fetish, and then people stopped and thought, wait a minute, there's only 4 names can go on here. He hasn't said RPK, he hasn't said Shocks, like, what's going on here? But again, the premise is not like best 4 players, so the pattern I'm seeing here is, first of all, they're all in some sense in-game leaders. They're all people where, to some sense, they are like integral to their team winning. Some of them individually, some not, but they're like a key kind of like shaping force. Was this some sort of the rationale, the philosophy of why you picked these 4?
Yeah, especially because when you talked to me about this and said the fact that they don't necessarily have to be the best players of their time or in the game, etc. I wanted to more or less focus on a lot of the players kind of in the shadows in that sense. Not necessarily that any of these were unknowns when they were playing, but they would never be necessarily the focal point of their lineup. But they were a massive reason for their success, and also the fact that in some cases they've gone different routes about it. Existence and Fetish kind of more similar in that sense, that they started from the bottom and worked their way gradually up, and then you have PHP, who basically made all of Eastern Europe relevant in a game, which is a pretty big accomplishment in itself. Managed to put that entire part of Europe on the map. So yeah, I had to think for a long while about who I actually wanted to bring in, but yeah, I can say that I have a slight bias towards in-game leaders, but I think that's because they have such an integral part of what makes a team good and what makes them successful over a long period of time, and that's why they should be held to high praise more than just. And again, this is not me trivializing individual skill or anything, but not just being the best guy on the server, but actually being the one who makes all the puzzle pieces fit and make the entire machinery work.